I was standing in my driveway in Cincinnati, staring at a laminated notice zip-tied to my car door handle, when I realized my mental health was about to become collateral damage in someone else's power trip. The notice had blank spaces filled in by hand with a Sharpie, and the handwriting matched the same angry scrawl I had seen on 3 other violation warnings in the past 2 months. I had moved to the landing at Riverstone Covenant Association 6 months earlier because the rent was cheap and I needed a quiet place to rebuild after a rough year. I work as a community event staffer, so I know how crowds and meetings actually work, and I can smell organizational dysfunction from a mile away. This HOA reeked of it. The neighborhood was retirement-heavy, which meant gossip spread faster than snowmelt, and every minor infraction turned into a full-blown scandal by dinner time. The notice said my vehicle was abandoned and would be towed within 24 hours unless I contacted the special assessment coordinator immediately. My car was not abandoned. It was parked in my assigned spot. The only thing wrong with it was that 3 inches of snow from last night's storm had covered the license plate. I brushed the snow off the plate with my glove and pulled out my phone to take a picture. The plate was perfectly visible now. Registration current, everything legal. I had been dealing with harassment from this HOA since October, but this was the first time they had threatened to tow my car. The special assessment coordinator was a woman named Priscilla Pennington, though everyone called her by her middle name, Karen, because it fit. She had shoulder-length wavy medium brown hair and always wore a bright red puffer coat with a matching red knit hat, like she wanted to be spotted from space. She was in her late 50s and had the kind of voice that could strip paint. I had seen her at the monthly board meetings, sitting in the front row with a clipboard, taking notes on everyone who spoke. She loved to interrupt people mid-sentence and remind them that the board had rules. Her favorite phrase, which she deployed at least twice per meeting, was, "I am going to make sure the board hears about this." The phone number on the notice went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining that my car was not abandoned, the plate was just snow-covered, and I had photographic proof. Then I went inside to make coffee and figure out my next move. My apartment was a small 2-bedroom unit on the ground floor of a 3-story building. The complex had about 200 units total, most of them occupied by retirees who had nothing better to do than police their neighbors. The HOA had set up a hotline specifically for reporting violations, and Karen controlled it. She encouraged people to call in tips, and she personally followed up on every single one. It was a system designed for maximum harassment, and it worked. By noon, I had a second notice on my door. This one said I had failed to respond to the first notice, and my vehicle would be towed at 6 p.m. unless I paid a $200 emergency processing fee. I called the number again. No answer. I called the property management company listed on the HOA website. They said they did not handle special assessments and I needed to talk to Karen directly. I asked if Karen was actually authorized to issue towing orders. The woman on the phone said she assumed so, but she would have to check. She put me on hold for 10 minutes, then came back and said Karen was listed as the special assessment coordinator in the directory, so yes, she probably had that authority. I asked for a copy of the appointment paperwork. She said she would email it to me. The email never came. At 4 p.m., I walked over to the HOA office, which was located in the clubhouse building near the main gate. The door was locked. A handwritten sign taped to the glass said the office was closed due to weather. I could see Karen inside through the window. She was sitting at a desk, sorting through a stack of laminated notice templates. I knocked. She looked up, saw me, and deliberately turned her back. I knocked again. She did not move. I took out my phone and started recording. She stood up, walked to the door, and flipped the deadbolt without opening it. Then she pointed at the sign and mouthed the words, "Closed." I held up my phone so she could see I was recording. She smiled, pulled down the window blind, and disappeared. I went back to my apartment and called a towing company to ask what their procedure was for HOA-requested tows. The dispatcher said they needed written authorization from an HOA officer and proof that the vehicle violated a recorded covenant. I asked if they verified the officer's authority. He laughed and said no, they just trusted the HOA. I asked what happened if the tow was disputed. He said I could file a complaint with the police, but the car would still be in their impound lot and I would still have to pay the fees to get it out. I thanked him and hung up. Then I started searching the HOA covenants and bylaws, which were posted on the community website as a scanned PDF from 1997. The image quality was terrible, but I found the section on towing. It said any vehicle parked in violation of community standards could be towed after 72 hours written notice, and the notice had to be approved by a majority vote of the board. I checked the date on my first notice. It was dated today, not 72 hours ago. Today. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The officer who answered said it sounded like a civil dispute and I should contact an attorney. I asked if I could file a report for harassment. He said I could, but it would not stop the tow. He suggested I move my car off the property until I sorted it out. I asked where I was supposed to park it. He said that was not his problem. I thanked him and hung up. It was 5 p.m. I had 1 hour before the tow truck arrived. I went outside and moved my car to a visitor spot 3 buildings away. Then I took pictures of the new location, the cleared license plate, and the laminated notices. I texted the pictures to the property management company email and copied the HOA president, whose contact info was listed on the website. At 5:45, a tow truck pulled into the complex and drove straight to my assigned spot. I watched from my apartment window. The driver got out, looked around, checked his paperwork, and called someone. A minute later, Karen came walking across the parking lot in her red coat and red hat, clipboard in hand. She pointed at my empty spot and started talking. The driver shook his head. She pulled out her phone and showed him something on the screen. He shrugged and got back in his truck. Karen walked over to the visitor spots and started checking license plates. I grabbed my coat and went outside. She saw me coming and immediately started walking toward me. Her face was flushed and her jaw was tight. She stopped about 6 feet away and said, "You moved your car. That is obstruction." I said, "My car was not abandoned." She said, "It was snow-covered and unidentifiable. That is the same as abandoned." I said, "I cleared the plate 4 hours ago and sent you pictures." She said, "I never received any pictures." I pulled out my phone and showed her the sent messages. She glanced at the screen and said, "Those are not official HOA channels. You have to use the violation hotline." I said, "I called the hotline twice. You did not answer." She said, "Then you should have come to the office." I said, "I did. You locked the door and ignored me." She said, "The office was closed." I said, "You were sitting right there." She said, "I am going to make sure the board hears about this." I took a breath and kept my voice steady. I said, "The bylaws say you need 72 hours written notice and a board vote before you can tow." She said, "I am the special assessment coordinator. I do not need a board vote for emergency removals." I said, "Show me the bylaw that says that." She said, "I do not have to show you anything." I said, "Then I am filing a police report for attempted theft." She laughed and said, "Go ahead. They will tell you it is a civil matter." I said, "That is fine. I will also file a complaint with the property management company and request an audit of your authorization." She stopped laughing. She said, "You are wasting everyone's time." I said, "Then prove you are authorized. Show me the appointment paperwork." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said, "We decide what is visible from the street." I did not understand what she meant at first. Then I realized she was quoting a line from a board meeting 3 months ago, when she had argued that any item visible from the public right-of-way could be regulated by the HOA, even if it was on private property. Someone had challenged her, saying that was not in the covenants, and she had shouted that exact phrase, "We decide what is visible from the street." It had become a running joke among the few residents who actually paid attention. Now she was using it as a threat. I said, "That is not a legal standard." She said, "It is HOA policy." I said, "Show me the policy in writing." She turned and walked back to the tow truck. The tow truck driver rolled down his window and she leaned in to talk to him. I could not hear what she said, but he nodded and started filling out a form. I walked over and said, "Excuse me, can I see your authorization paperwork?" He handed me a clipboard. The form had my license plate number, my assigned spot number, and a checkbox marked, "Owner Request." There was a signature at the bottom, but it was illegible. I said, "This says Owner Request. I am the owner and I did not request this." He said the HOA is the owner of the parking spot. I said no. The HOA is the covenant authority. I am the leaseholder. He said, I do not know anything about that. I just go where they tell me. I said, if you tow my car without proper authorization, I will file charges for theft. He looked at Karen. She said, he is bluffing. The driver said, I am not getting involved in this. He put the truck in gear and drove away. Karen stood in the empty parking spot and watched the tow truck disappear. Then she turned to me and said, you just made this much worse for yourself. I said, how is that? She said, the board is going to assess you for the tow cancellation fee. I said, there is no such thing as a tow cancellation fee. She said, there is now. I am drafting the resolution tonight. I said, you cannot draft resolutions. You are not on the board. She said, I am the special assessment coordinator. I have emergency authority. I said, show me the appointment paperwork. She said, I do not have to show you anything. Then she turned and walked toward the clubhouse. I followed her. She walked faster. I kept pace. She stopped suddenly and spun around. She said, if you follow me one more step, I will issue a trespass warning. I said, you cannot issue a trespass warning. You are not law enforcement. She pulled out her phone and said, I am calling the police right now and telling them you are harassing me. I stopped walking. I said, go ahead. I will wait right here. She dialed and put the phone to her ear. I took out my phone and started recording. She saw the camera and her face went even redder. She said into the phone, yes, I need an officer at the landing at Riverstone. There is a resident who is following me and refusing to leave me alone. She gave the address and her name. Then she said, he has been harassing me for months. He moved his car to avoid a legitimate tow, and now he is stalking me. I felt my chest tighten. That was a complete lie, and she said it calmly, like she had rehearsed it. The dispatcher said something, and Karen said, yes, I will stay on the line. She looked at me and smiled. I stayed where I was and kept recording. A patrol car arrived about 10 minutes later. 2 officers got out. One of them walked over to Karen, and the other walked over to me. The officer talking to me was a younger guy, probably late 20s. He asked for my ID and I handed it over. He asked what was going on. I said, she tried to tow my car without proper notice or authorization. I moved it to a visitor spot. She followed the tow truck over here, and when I asked to see her paperwork, she called you and said I was harassing her. He asked if I had followed her. I said, I walked in the same direction she was walking, toward the clubhouse, which is a common area. I stopped as soon as she threatened me. He asked if I had threatened her. I said no. I have video of the whole interaction. He asked to see it. I showed him the recording. He watched about 30 seconds, then nodded and handed my phone back. The other officer walked over with Karen. She was talking rapidly and gesturing toward me. The younger officer held up his hand and said, ma'am, I need you to stop talking for a second. He looked at his partner and said, he has video. It backs up his version. The older officer sighed and said to Karen, did you try to have his car towed? She said yes, because it was abandoned. He said, was it abandoned? She said it was snow-covered. He said, that is not the same thing. She said, the HOA has the authority to remove vehicles that are unidentifiable. He said, do you have documentation of that authority? She hesitated. Then she said, it is in the bylaws. He said, can you show me the section? She said, I do not have a copy with me. He said, then I suggest you get one before you try to tow someone's car again. Karen's face went from red to purple. She said, this is an HOA matter. You do not have jurisdiction. The officer said, attempting to tow a vehicle without proper authorization is not an HOA matter. It is theft. She said, I am the special assessment coordinator. I have emergency authority. He said, who appointed you? She said, the board. He said, when? She did not answer. He said, ma'am, if you cannot provide documentation of your authority, then you need to stop threatening this man's property. She said, I am going to make sure the board hears about this." The officer said, "You do that." He turned to me and said, "Do you want to file a report?" I said yes. He said, "Come with me." I spent the next 20 minutes sitting in the back of the patrol car, giving my statement. The officer took notes and asked for copies of the notices, the text messages, the photos, and the video. I sent everything to his email. He said the report would be forwarded to the prosecutor's office, but he doubted they would pursue charges unless there was a pattern of behavior. I said there is a pattern. She has been harassing me since October. He said, "Do you have documentation?" I said, "I have every notice she has ever given me." He said, "Bring it to the station tomorrow and ask for Detective Morris. He handles HOA disputes." I thanked him and got out of the car. Karen was gone. The patrol car drove away. I walked back to my apartment and sat on the couch in the dark for a while, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. I had been managing my mental health pretty well for the past few months, but this kind of harassment was exactly the thing that could push me over the edge. I needed to shut this down fast. The next morning, I went to the police station and asked for Detective Morris. He was a big guy in his 50s with a shaved head and a Chicago accent. He listened to my story, reviewed the documents, and said, "Yeah, this is a mess. HOA disputes always are." I said, "Can you do anything?" He said, "Not really. This is civil. But I can tell you that if she tries to tow your car again without proper procedure, that is criminal, and you should call us immediately." I said, "What about the harassment?" He said, "Document everything. Get a lawyer. File for a restraining order if it continues." I said, "I cannot afford a lawyer." He said, "Legal aid might help." He gave me a business card for a local nonprofit. I thanked him and left. I called the nonprofit from my car. They said they had a 3-month wait list. I asked if they did emergency consultations. They said only for domestic violence or eviction cases. I said this was sort of an eviction case, since the HOA was threatening to put a lien on my unit if I did not pay the fake fees. The intake worker said, "That is not an eviction. That is a collections dispute. You need to file in small claims court." I said, "How do I do that?" She said, "Go to the courthouse and ask for the pro se clerk. They will walk you through it." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in the parking lot and tried to figure out my next move. I needed to prove that Karen was not authorized to do what she was doing. The property management company had never sent me the appointment paperwork. I called them again. The same woman answered. I said, "You were supposed to email me Karen's appointment paperwork yesterday." She said, "I looked for it, but I could not find it in our files." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means we do not have a record of her appointment." I said, "How is she the special assessment coordinator if there is no record?" She said, "I assume the board appointed her verbally." I said, "Can you check the board meeting minutes?" She said, "I can try. Hold on." She put me on hold for 15 minutes. When she came back, she said, "I found references to a special assessment committee in the October meeting minutes, but no appointment resolution." I said, "Can you send me those minutes?" She said, "I will email them to you." I said, "Can you also send me the quorum log for that meeting?" She said, "What is a quorum log?" I said, "It is the attendance record that proves the meeting had enough members to conduct business." She said, "I do not think we keep those." I said, "You have to. It is required by state law." She said, "Let me check." She put me on hold again. 5 minutes later, she came back and said, "I found a sign-in sheet. It is pretty messy. I will scan it and send it over." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Is there anything else?" I said, "Yes. Can you tell me if there are any special assessments currently active against my unit?" She said, "Hold on." She clicked around for a minute, then said, "No, there is nothing on your account." I said, "So Karen has not filed any fees or charges?" She said, "Not that I can see." I said, "Good. Thank you." I hung up and waited for the email. The email came through 20 minutes later. I opened the October meeting minutes and started reading. The section on special assessments was a mess. It said the board had discussed creating a committee to handle emergency violations and cost recovery, but there was no vote recorded. The next paragraph said Priscilla Pennington had volunteered to coordinate the effort and the board had thanked her. That was it. No appointment, no resolution, no authority. I opened the quorum log. It was a wrinkled piece of paper with 7 names scribbled on it in different handwriting. The HOA bylaws required a minimum of 5 board members to conduct official business. I counted the names. 7. That should have been fine. But then I noticed that 2 of the names had the same last name, Pennington. One was listed as the secretary. The other was listed as a guest. I pulled up the HOA board roster on my phone. The secretary was listed as Gerald Pennington. I Googled him. He was married to Priscilla Pennington. She was the guest. Guests could not be counted toward quorum. That meant the October meeting only had 6 valid attendees, and one of them had left early, according to a note in the margin. If someone had left early, the quorum might have dropped below the minimum before the special assessment discussion happened. I did not have proof of that, but it was worth investigating. I forwarded the email to myself 3 times, just to make sure I had backups. Then I started putting together a timeline. October meeting, Special Assessment Committee discussed. No formal vote. November, Karen started issuing violations under the Special Assessment Authority. December, I received my first notice. January, snowstorm, tow attempt, police report. I had everything documented. I just needed to connect the dots. I decided to go to the next board meeting, which was scheduled for the following week, and ask Karen directly to provide her appointment paperwork. If she could not, I would move to have all of her actions invalidated. It was a long shot, but it was better than doing nothing. The next complication hit 2 days later. I got a call from the tow yard where my car would have been taken if the tow had gone through. The clerk said, "We have a record that you disputed a tow order on file, and we need you to come in and sign a release form." I said, "Why? The car was never towed." He said, "Our system shows an open work order. If you do not close it, we will charge a storage fee." I said, "That makes no sense. The car is in my possession." He said, "I am just telling you what the system says. You need to bring proof of ownership and sign the release, or we will put a lien on the vehicle." I said, "Who opened the work order?" He said, "The HOA." I said, "Which person at the HOA?" He said, "I do not have a name. I just have an account number." I said, "Can you look up the account number and tell me when it was opened?" He said, "Hold on." He clicked around for a minute, then said, "It was opened 2 days ago." I said, "After the tow was canceled?" He said, "Yeah, looks like it." I said, "That is fraud." He said, "I do not know anything about that. I just need you to come in and close the work order." I drove to the tow yard that afternoon. It was on the east side of Cincinnati, in an industrial area near the river. The office was a small concrete building with a chain-link fence around the lot. I walked in and gave the clerk my name. He pulled up the work order and said, "Yeah, here it is. I need to see your registration and insurance." I handed him the documents. He made copies and said, "Now I need a letter from the HOA saying they are withdrawing the tow request." I said, "The HOA never had authority to request the tow in the first place." He said, "That is not my problem. I need the letter or the work order stays open." I said, "What happens if the work order stays open?" He said, "We charge a $50 administrative fee per week until it is closed." I said, "That is extortion." He said, "That is our policy." I said, "Show me the policy in writing." He pulled out a binder and flipped to a page that said, "Open work orders are subject to administrative fees until resolved by the requesting party." I said, "I am not the requesting party." He said, "Then get the requesting party to close it." I called the property management company from the parking lot. The woman I had been talking to was not available. I left a message. Then I called the HOA president, whose number was listed on the website. It went to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking for a written withdrawal of the tow request. Then I sat in my car and tried to think. This was escalating in ways I had not anticipated. Karen was not just harassing me. She was actively creating financial traps that would cost me money even if I won the dispute. The tow yard fees, the fake special assessments, the threat of a lien. It was all designed to bleed me dry until I gave up and moved out. I thought about my mental health. I thought about how much energy I had left to fight this. I thought about the fact that I had moved here to find some peace, and instead I had walked into a nightmare. Then I thought about the evidence I had, the missing appointment paperwork, the invalid quorum log, the timeline of Karen's violations. I did not mention my evidence yet, because I wanted her to repeat the story first. If she lied to the board about her authority and I had proof she was lying, that would be the end of her. I just needed to wait for the right moment. The city had posted a potential ticket window for uncleared sidewalks, and Karen wanted it on my record. She had been pushing the board to implement a sidewalk violation program for months, and the snowstorm had given her the perfect excuse. If I could prove she was using the program to target me personally, that would strengthen my case even more. I decided to document every interaction, every notice, every phone call. I set up a dedicated folder on my phone and started saving everything. The board meeting was on a Tuesday night at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. I got there early and sat in the back row. The room was set up with folding chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. There were about 20 residents in attendance, mostly retirees. Karen was in the front row with her clipboard and a stack of laminated notice templates. She was wearing her red coat and red hat, even though the room was warm. The board president called the meeting to order and started going through the agenda. Old business, new business, treasurer's report. Everything was moving fast. I waited for the public comment section. When the president opened the floor, I raised my hand. He nodded at me. I stood up and said, "I have a question about the special assessment coordinator position." The president said, "Go ahead." I said, "Can you provide documentation of the appointment?" He looked at Karen. She stood up and said, "I was appointed in October by unanimous consent of the board." I said, "Was there a vote?" She said, "It was a voice vote." I said, "Is there a record of that vote in the minutes?" She said, "The minutes reflect the board's intent." I said, "The minutes say you volunteered. They do not say you were appointed." She said, "That is semantics." The board president said, "The board recognizes Priscilla's contribution to the community and supports her work." I said that is not the same as appointing her to an official position with enforcement authority. He said, "We will take your comment under advisement." I said, "I also have concerns about the quorum for the October meeting." He said, "The quorum was valid." I said, "2 people signed in as Pennington. 1 was a guest. Guests do not count toward quorum." He said, "That is an administrative detail." I said, "It is a legal requirement." He said, "We will review the October minutes and provide a response." I said, "When?" He said, "At the next meeting." I said, "That is a month away." He said, "That is our schedule." I sat down. Karen turned around and looked at me. She was smiling. After the meeting, I waited outside the clubhouse. A few residents came up to me and said they appreciated me asking questions, because they had been wondering about Karen's authority too. One woman said Karen had threatened to fine her for parking her car in a guest spot overnight when her garage door was broken. Another man said Karen had issued a violation notice because his trash can was visible from the street on a non-trash day, even though the HOA rules specifically allowed trash cans to be stored on the side of the house. I asked if they had kept the notices. They both said yes. I gave them my number and asked them to send me copies. They agreed. Then a man in his 60s walked over and said, "You are asking the right questions." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I install and maintain the gate systems for this community. I have been working here for 5 years." I said, "What does that have to do with the HOA?" He said, "The access logs show every time someone uses a key fob or a code to enter the community. Karen has been using board-level access codes to enter the property at odd hours, late at night, early in the morning, times when no one else is around." I said, "Why would she do that?" He said, "I do not know, but it is not normal." I said, "Can you provide copies of the access logs?" He said, "I can, but it has to be a formal request through the board." I said, "What if I subpoena them?" He said, "Then I would have to comply." I said, "Good to know." I went home and started drafting a small claims complaint. I listed Karen as the defendant, along with the HOA. I included counts for harassment, attempted theft, and fraud. I attached all of my evidence: the notices, the text messages, the photos, the police report, the October minutes, the quorum log, and the statements from the other residents. I filed it online the next day. The filing fee was $35. The court scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks out. I printed the confirmation and taped it to my fridge. Then, I waited. 2 days later, I got a notice on my door. It was another laminated template with blank spaces filled in by hand. This one said I was banned from using the community gym, the pool, and the clubhouse common areas until further notice due to disruptive behavior at the board meeting. I took a picture of the notice and called the property management company. The woman I had been talking to said, "I do not have any record of that restriction." I said, "Karen just put it on my door." She said, "She does not have the authority to restrict access to common areas. That requires a board vote." I said, "Can you email me confirmation of that?" She said, "I will send it right now." I said, "Thank you." The email came through 5 minutes later. I printed it and put it in my evidence folder. That night, I went to the gym. It was located in a separate building near the pool. I swiped my key fob at the entrance. The door unlocked. I walked in. Karen was sitting on a bench near the treadmills. She stood up as soon as she saw me and said, "You are not allowed to be here." I said, "According to who?" She said, "According to me." I said, "You do not have the authority to restrict my access." She said, "I issued a trespass warning." I said, "You are not law enforcement. You cannot issue trespass warnings." She pulled out her phone and said, "I am calling the police right now." I said, "Go ahead." I pulled out my phone and showed her the email from the property management company. I said, "This says you do not have the authority to restrict access." She read the email. Her face went red. She said, "We decide what is visible from the street." I said, "That is not relevant." She said, "You are harassing me." I said, "I am using the gym. You are the one who is here, waiting for me." She said, "I am going to make sure the board hears about this." I walked past her and got on a treadmill. She stood there for a minute, staring at me, then she left. I did my workout and went home. The next morning I had a voicemail from the HOA president. He said, "I understand there was an incident at the gym last night. We need to discuss your behavior. Please call me back." I called him back. He said, "Karen says you confronted her at the gym and refused to leave when she asked you to." I said that is not what happened. She was waiting for me at the gym and tried to enforce a restriction she does not have the authority to issue. He said, "She is acting on behalf of the board." I said, "Show me the board resolution that gave her that authority." He said, "We do not need a resolution for every administrative action." I said, "Restricting access to common areas is not an administrative action. It is a disciplinary action, and it requires a hearing." He said, "We will schedule a hearing." I said, "Good. In the meantime, I will continue using the gym." He said, "If you do, we will consider it a violation." I said, "Of what rule?" He did not answer. I said, "I will see you at the hearing." I hung up. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I prepared a written statement and printed copies of all my evidence. The hearing was held in the clubhouse on a Thursday night. The board was seated at the long table. Karen was in the front row. I sat in the back. The president called the meeting to order and said, "We are here to discuss the complaint filed by the HOA against the resident regarding disruptive behavior." I said, "I did not receive notice of a complaint." He said, "We sent it to your email." I checked my phone. There was an email from 2 days ago with a PDF attached. The PDF was a one-page letter that said I had violated community standards by harassing board members and ignoring administrative directives. It was signed by Karen. I said, "This letter is not a formal complaint. It does not cite any specific rule violations." He said, "It cites disruptive behavior." I said, "That is not a rule." He said, "It is covered under general conduct standards." I said, "Show me the section." He flipped through a binder and read, "Residents are expected to conduct themselves in a manner consistent with community harmony." I said, "That is subjective." He said, "The board has discretion to interpret it." I said, "Then I am invoking my right to a fair hearing. I want to present my evidence." The president sighed and said, "Go ahead." I stood up and distributed copies of my evidence to each board member. I said, "The person who filed this complaint is not authorized to act on behalf of the HOA. She was never formally appointed to the Special Assessment Coordinator position." The October meeting minutes show that she volunteered, but there was no vote. The quorum log shows that the meeting may not have had enough valid attendees to conduct business, because one of the sign-ins was a guest. I also have evidence that she has been issuing violation notices without board approval, attempting to tow vehicles without following proper procedure, and restricting access to common areas without authority. I have statements from other residents who have been targeted by the same behavior. I have a police report documenting her attempt to have my car towed without cause. I have access logs from the gate vendor showing that she has been entering the property at unusual hours. I have email confirmation from the property management company that she does not have the authority to restrict my access to common areas. And I have a timeline showing that all of this started after I questioned her authority at a board meeting. The board members looked at the evidence. One of them said, "This is a lot of information." The president said, "We will need time to review it." I said, "I also have board meeting minutes and a quorum log that prove the vote was invalid." I show the tow yard the paperwork and they refused to keep cooperating. The room went quiet. Karen stood up and said, "That is a lie." I said, "I have the documents right here." I pulled out the October minutes and the quorum log and held them up. Karen said, "Those are not official." I said, "They came from the property management company." She said, "They are incomplete." I said, "Then provide the complete version." She did not answer. The president said, "We will take this under advisement and provide a written response within 30 days. I said, "The small claims hearing is in 2 weeks. If you do not resolve this before then, I will present all of this evidence to the judge." He said, "That is your right." The meeting ended. I walked out. Karen followed me into the parking lot. She said, "You think you are so smart." I said, "I am just asking for accountability." She said, "You are going to regret this." I said. She said, "It is a promise." I took out my phone and started recording. She saw the camera and stopped talking. Then she turned and walked away. I got in my car and drove home. My hands were shaking again. I sat in the driveway for a while, trying to calm down. I thought about what the gate vendor had said about the access logs. I thought about the fact that Karen had been entering the property at odd hours. I thought about the laminated notice templates and the blank spaces filled in by hand. I thought about the fact that she had tried to tow my car, restrict my access, and file a fake complaint, all within a 2-week span. This was not just harassment. This was a coordinated campaign. And I was going to stop it. The small claims hearing was on a Friday morning. I got there early and checked in with the clerk. The judge was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. She called my case first. I sat at the plaintiff's table. Karen sat at the defendant's table with the HOA president. The judge said, "This is a dispute regarding HOA enforcement actions. Plaintiff, summarize your claim." I said, "The defendant attempted to tow my vehicle without proper notice or authorization, issued multiple violation notices without board approval, restricted my access to common areas without authority, and filed a fake complaint to retaliate against me for questioning her authority. I have documentation of all of these actions, including evidence that she was never formally appointed to the position she claims to hold." The judge said, "Defendant, respond." Karen said, "I am the Special Assessment Coordinator. I have full authority to enforce community standards." The judge said, "Do you have documentation of your appointment?" Karen said, "It was a voice vote." The judge said, "Is there a record of that vote?" Karen said, "It is in the minutes." The judge said, "Plaintiff, do you have a copy of the minutes?" I handed the judge the October minutes. She read them. Then she said, "This does not show a vote. It shows that you volunteered. Karen said, "That is the same thing." The judge said, "No, it is not." The judge reviewed the rest of my evidence. She asked questions about the quorum log, the tow attempt, the access restriction, and the fake complaint. She asked Karen to provide documentation of her authority. Karen could not. The judge said, "Based on the evidence presented, I find that the defendant acted without proper authorization and engaged in a pattern of harassment against the plaintiff. I am ordering the HOA to cease all enforcement actions against the plaintiff and to route all future communication through legal counsel. I am also ordering the defendant to pay the plaintiff's filing fees and compensatory damages in the amount of $500 for emotional distress." The HOA is directed to conduct a formal review of the Special Assessment Coordinator position and provide written confirmation of the outcome to the plaintiff within 60 days. Case closed. She banged the gavel. Karen stood up and said, "This is not over." The judge said, "Yes, it is. Sit down." Karen sat down. I walked out of the courtroom. The HOA sent me a letter 2 weeks later. It said the board had conducted a review and determined that the Special Assessment Coordinator position had never been formally created, and therefore Priscilla Pennington had no authority to act on behalf of the HOA. The board was implementing new procedures for appointing committee members and would require all future enforcement actions to be approved by a majority vote. The letter was signed by the president and copied to the property management company. I filed it with my evidence folder. Karen moved out of the community a month later. I heard from the gate vendor that she had been asked to resign from all HOA activities. The board replaced her with a retired accountant who actually followed the rules. The harassment stopped. I kept using the gym. I kept my car in my assigned spot. I kept my receipts and my documentation, just in case. And I never forgot the lesson. When someone tries to use fake authority to control you, make them prove it in writing.